Hi guys, welcome to biology once again. This is going to be our first video lecture, and following along with our schedule, this is going to be chapter 15, where we are going to talk about evolution. So let me pull up our chapter PowerPoint. What I'm going to do is go ahead and share my screen. It's going to take a little bit to set up. All right, there we go. It's going to look a little funny until I get rid of that overlap. All right, guys, let's just jump right in. I'm going to try not to spend too much time because I know you guys don't want to listen to a 3 hour long lecture, but believe me, I can definitely make it 3 hours long. So when we meet in our typical 8 week class, each lecture is about 3 hours long before 16 week classes. They are actually about an hour and a half. But still, I want to make it much, much shorter than that. So let me jump on in. So we'll try to communicate and clear up a lot of misconceptions about evolution. We'll also talk a little bit, but not too much, about how religion intersects evolution. And then we'll show you some examples of evolution as well. So wisdom teeth is one of the main things that people think of and are used as an example. Our modern jaw and mouth size is too tiny for most people to have their wisdom teeth come in. They come in crooked or impacted, and they generally cause inflammation and swelling. So, and some people, they don't come in at all. They're missing some of them. And then in a group of people, they come in completely normally. So while those teeth may have had an important role in the past, our diet and our jaw size have changed over time. And so those extra teeth aren't as important and in fact end up causing problems. So that's an example of evolutionary change that kind of just causes us more problems, doesn't necessarily benefit us. Another example is flightless birds. When people think of birds, they think of wings and they think of flight. Um, Evolution doesn't always strive to make the quote unquote best. We'll talk about what evolution does or does not do and what drives it. We'll talk about that by the end of the chapter. So, chapter at a glance, the different kinds of scientists who sort of contribute major ideas to the collective like evolutionary principles we accept today. We'll talk about natural selection and then evidence for evolution in like everyday life. So at its basis, evolution is change over time, and it affects the population. So the members of the population changes in their characteristics. So nothing too crazy. Which really phrased like that doesn't make it super controversial. But wait, it's about to get kind of controversial right off the bat. So, religion and the church has played interesting roles in history and across societies. So, really, when we look back into evolutionary thought, we have to think about how much science has changed and how much people's opinions of science has changed over time. So, like the discovery of viruses and bacteria and fungi and diseases, discovery of the microscope. So, before these things, people sort of, I don't want to say like, well, they just didn't know. And it took a while to convince people of these things as well. Scientists, even scientists among themselves, struggled for a while because the bigger and more elaborate the change, the more proof you have, and the harder it is going to be to quote unquote prove this new idea. In reality, in science, we have theories which are supported by scientific laws. So laws are things that you shouldn't expect to change. Theories can change depending upon new laws that are discovered or old. So for the most part, things you don't expect to change are supporting an idea, and this collective idea is sort of like a summary of these laws. And you kind of, if you are wrong, there should be like a legitimate reason why you are wrong that you can describe in words, and there should be sort of a new theory that kind of explains things better than your old one. So in science, we don't really support hypotheses. Well, we support hypotheses, we don't prove them. So religion in the past has played various roles in our understanding of science. Sometimes religion has set to put a damper on scientific thought or expression. In reality, it shouldn't be as controversial as it is, in my opinion, because science deals with the natural, so what you can see, manipulate, and touch, and religion deals with the supernatural. So science will never quote unquote prove religion because they deal in two separate areas. Occasionally, there are some there's some overlap as far as things like creationism, for instance, and big debate over the dinosaurs or the amount of time that the Earth or universe has been created. Some people will say in Genesis it describes, for instance, 7 literal days. Other religious people will say it's definitely not 7 actual literal days. Some will say, oh, it actually describes creation of the earth, but not the creation of the universe. So even religion is subject to background, understanding, and interpretation. So evolution is the same. There's a lot of misconceptions. I think people can get overly eager and want to say we either 100% have to teach religion along this, or we need to ban this evil evolutionary talk, when in fact it's just a way to sum up things we've seen and through experimentation and manipulation. And if something else comes along that better supports say like religious text, then I don't think scientists will immediately say, no, we can't use it because it magically supports religion. Um, I think what they're supposed to do is go along with uh, the most logical ideas that require the least amount of assumptions. So there are different scientists and philosophers that have contributed to our modern understanding of evolution. And they do so by basically looking at what they see in nature. So, for instance, in this slide, we have different scientists who each in their own way contributed to the modern understanding. And some of them were way off, others were close. These are all just different major theories they had. For instance, this scientist suggested that species change over time, and that was a big deal because in the religion, dominant religion at the time, they believed that if it was made by God, that it was perfect, and that it was not able to be changed because then it would no longer be perfect. In reality, I've yet to see any religious text that claim that, but the religious authorities at the time swore that that was their honest interpretation of their religious text. And so it was a big deal to suggest that something wasn't perfect. The same thing, similar to the orbits of the planets in our solar system. The religious leaders at the time, which had great authority to affect scientists, how they practiced, thought that the orbits of planets had to be perfect circles because circles were perfect. In reality, I've never again read any religious text that suggested the circles were perfect, but this is what they believed, and it was part of their religion. And, there's the argument that some religions are mutually exclusive. All religions cannot be correct because some of them contradict each other. So I can kind of understand why scientists want to sort of independently verify and determine these things with experiments. So I don't think they're inherently anti-religion. They kind of want to objectively analyze and manipulate data so they can come to their own logic-based conclusions rather than sort of thinking or feeling or some really weird, hey, I'm a religious authority and I tell you this is correct and that's the only proof you need. They kind of want to prove it through principles of physics and engineering and math. So discovery of fossils, that kind of helped move the debate along because some of these organisms looked way different from organisms that we had in the present. In fact, the closer you get to the present, the more the fossils kind of look like modern day animals or organisms. So it helps support the idea of change over time. And also, they discovered that fossils were found in different layers of rock, and these layers corresponded to actual time periods. So across different locations and areas, you had similar layers. Another interesting thing to note is um, a lot of the fossils describe extinct organisms. So you're able to discover things and organisms that you had not ever seen before. And so the whole idea is if everything was perfect and nothing was ever supposed to change, well, if something existed before and no longer does, then things do change. Again, these aren't scientists arguing with scientists. It's more so like scientists trying to form their own discipline with sort of the religious state hierarchy saying, hey, we don't want anything that could threaten our position. I don't think it was 100% like an honest, hey, don't question us because we know best, but more like pride and threatening of positions. But again, that's speculation for me because I wasn't there. There were a few scientists that attempted to explain fossils through a non-evolutionary means. So catastrophism, like the Great Flood, and that could affect the way rock layers are formed and why you have certain species found in certain layers. And so the argument is that the species all existed together, but some great catastrophe actually caused the formation of what appears to be layers separated by time. And then other scientists countered that idea by saying, hey, if the Earth has been around for a long enough time, small changes and small forces like wind and water and big forces like volcanoes over time um, can actually contribute to a large change. So really small changes over a really long period of time lead to really big changes. And people with no conception of how long that time was, or look at it and say there's absolutely no way that such a big change could happen when in fact a small tiny changes do mathematically eventually accumulate. The types of the time periods that scientists are describing are so large that our human brain really can't fathom goes along a period. So we say things like, "Oh, it's impossible." Like a tiny change can't lead to a completely new organism, when in fact, mathematically, again, tiny changes do accumulate. So it's the argument, if anything, is exactly how old the Earth is, and that's where a lot of religious versus science debate hinges on. Though interestingly enough, there are religious people that do still believe in evolution. So you have young Earth, and then you have old Earth religious people. So just food for thought. That part is for free. And so the idea that our landscape is produced by gradual processes is called uniformitarianism. And so we got to talk about what actually caused evolution as well. And so Lamarck, he had this idea of use and disuse. So it was the idea that, let me see that slide. It was the idea that the most useful traits actually just get passed on to their offspring, but there really wasn't a good understanding, or really an understanding at all, of genetics and chromosomes and DNA. So these people had to go out on a limb and think really hard on how different traits could pass when they didn't know that traits existed. So Gregor Mendel, we talk about that in the first biology. At the very end of it, we have our last unit on genetics. And so he basically uh, did pea plant experiments to uh, document the idea that different traits exist and that they pass in certain predictable patterns. And so he's the father of genetics because of that. And then good old Darwin, I think most people have heard about him and his origin of species and his idea of um, a survival of the fittest, driven by natural selection. So, what drives evolutionary change, according to Darwin? It would be that over time, as populations continue, parents have children, those children have children, that the organisms that survive are the ones that are best suited for the environment, and the ones that are less suited will have less of them or not survive. And that what is considered beneficial from a survival standpoint is subject to something called selective evolutionary pressure. So whether it's something like the size of your food source, so like size of trees, or your climate, so like your coat color, if you live in like a snowy climate, like the presence of a white coat can help you as prey blend in and hide, or can help you as a predator to blend in while you're stalking. So different things like that. Um, the predators that are best suited for killing prey end up killing prey and surviving longer than those that starve. So ultimately, like, different traits are more beneficial, and with sexual reproduction, you get sort of a shuffling around of the offspring of their traits. So they inherit for diploid organisms half their chromosome from their mom and half from their dad. And so it creates a new novel combination in the offspring, subject to the Mendelian laws of genetics, of course. And so those different traits they have, if you have enough offspring, you'll have different kinds of traits present within your family, and some will be more beneficial than others. And the idea is that if it's slightly beneficial and they give them a slight edge, then they'll have children, and those children may potentially have some slight benefit that gives them an edge. So these different slight benefits, subject to the evolutionary pressure at the time to what is considered beneficial, eventually can accumulate, and you may, over an incredibly long period of time, end up with a completely different species. So Darwin, his theory rests upon four postulates. So postulate one, individuals actually differ from one another. Postulate two, differences among members of a population are due to characteristics that can be passed from parent to offspring. Postulate three, in each generation, some individuals in a population survive and reproduce, while others are not successful at reproducing. And then postulate four, the fate of an individual is not determined entirely by luck or chance. So that's where you get into the natural selection and survival of the fittest. So you can actually see this really cool in like a biology lab when you start working with bacteria or viruses, how they can actually change over a relatively short period of time, because you can grow bacteria in a lab in just a few days, and from you'll do streak plate isolation. So one colony forming unit, you go and you streak plate it, and you can get a whole um, like lawn of new organism, new bacteria. And those different colonies are all different, like evolutionary or genetic lines. So every time they reproduce, there's a opportunity. So bacteria aren't sexually reproducing, don't get me wrong, but every time they get a chance to reproduce, mutations or random errors can occur, and some of these mutations can allow them to be more beneficial than others. So then, even though that they are asexually reproducing, they are not 100% the same when you run enough generations. And because bacteria divide and they're single-celled so rapidly, you do get a lot of generations in a relatively short period of time, in days. Whereas to see that same effect in like humans or dogs, which we talk about later in this chapter, you'd be talking about years and not days. All right, continuing to talk about natural selection. All right, so evolution in general, you have fossils, which we talked about. The next one on the list is looking at anatomy, how different structures can be similar or the same across species that you typically wouldn't think of as related. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, homologous versus analogous structures. So fossils, they basically show change over time. And if you compare the anatomy, you can see how different species, um, they're separate, but they basically split off from a common ancestor. And you can determine that based off of anatomy. And finding fossils of species you didn't know existed before can help fill in the missing gaps for that anatomy. So here we look at homologous structures. So let me go back one more. Um, so homologous structures, they're basically a structure that is a result of shared common ancestry. So genetically similar organisms that split off into different evolutionary routes have some of the same traits as that shared common ancestor. So here you can look at the bone structure and the equivalent of, I guess, like the hand and the arm, and these different organisms, dolphins, dogs, humans, seals, sheep, bats, pterodactyls, how the bone structure is really similar, and that's due to shared common ancestry. So if two organisms both have hands and arms and they shared a common ancestor, then those are probably similar hands and arms, as opposed to analogous structures, which we'll get to in a second. So defining officially homologous structures, they're structures that have the same evolutionary origin, despite any differences in current appearance or function. So that's, yeah, important to note. These hands and arms aren't all used exactly the same, but they are still essentially hands and arms from an evolutionary standpoint. We also have vestigial structures, which are left over from shared common ancestry and aren't really used in the current organisms. And so you also have similarities that arise through something called convergent evolution. So it's a process with natural selection that causes non-homologous structures that serve similar functions to resemble each other. So for instance, the wing of an insect and the wing of a bird, or they both are wings, but they don't share the same anatomy, bone structure, design, weight, anything, but they both are still wings. And they may superficially look like each other because they're both wings. So these are called analogous structures. So they're a result because of like shared environment, but not as a result of shared ancestry. And in case you've never seen a wing before, here are two examples. Actually, there's a class in an upper level class you'll eventually be able to take called invertebrate zoology, in which you do actually get to see more of organisms slash insects slash invertebrates that you've never seen before. And in some classes, you get to capture some of them or hunt for them, hopefully find them and capture them, and get to look at the structures. I remember when I took a class in grad school, I was really obsessed with trying to capture a dragonfly, and all I could capture was a damselfly. And I know that may not mean anything to you now, but they were so cool. That's the first time I actually got to look at them up close. You can also look at the developmental stages in the womb of different organisms, and it can actually give you insight to the fact that they have shared ancestry or shared evolutionary relationships. So lemur, pig, human, you squint your eyes, they kind of all look the same early in development. Um, Obviously, as they go on in development, they'll skip some stages or add others till they eventually look way different. And then you can also be related from an evolutionary standpoint um, through shared common ancestry in things like your actual DNA and the genes that are present, say, for developing the photoreceptors of fruit fly, or some of the same genes responsible for, say, developing certain parts of the human eye. So you'll find similar gene sequencing patterns in, say, like the animal kingdom, despite the fact that for the most part, these organisms, you wouldn't consider them like superficially like similar to each other. So if you look at tiny like mouse and human, so in experiments, research experiments, a lot of times you'll run them on animals, say like lab rats, and it's because of how similar their DNA is. Of course, it's not so similar that they're also human because they're clearly a way different animal, but enough that different drugs and medicines and potentially food additives may react similarly. There are a couple times where it turns out, food has been pulled from the shelves because of, say, cancer risks in lab rats to find out that there's no such equivalent in humans. So the fact that species all like use genetic information in the form of DNA or RNA, and they all use the same set of 20 amino acids and build the same proteins. This lends evidence to the idea of evolution. So the argument is the reason why we have these shared processes is because we all shared common ancestry. And of course, you also don't have to wait for natural selection in every case. Sometimes you can manipulate it itself. You see this a lot with crops in the agricultural industry, and you can also see it in dogs with the different breeds. And in case you've never seen a breed of a dog, here's an example. And then there's this example about the cricket calls. This is an example of natural selection where the cricket calls ended up becoming quieter and less abundant. And it turns out they were being affected by a parasitic fly. And those that had a slightly different wing structure were the ones that were most likely to avoid the parasitic fly because this fly was locating them based off of uh, the sound they emit, their cricket song. And so those that had a quieter song, they do that. They produce a sound through their wings. Those that had slightly different wing structure through chance ended up having selective evolutionary pressure drive this change in their favor. So they ended up becoming more abundant as the generations went over time, till eventually you see very few of the ones with the old wing design because they are being targeted by predators. So it can be thought of as an evolutionary arms race where both the predators and the prey are subject to evolution. And then you see the same thing in resistance, in weed resistance to herbicides or weed killers, pest resistant to pesticides, and it can continue to damage crops. So I think that actually about wraps it up for evolution. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That's about it for the content for today. I will see you next time as we discuss the next chapter.